listening to them, and he's going to do the interpretation, Mohammed. I was just listening to
But
him.
but whatever is going down the Arabic stream, we've given only what comes from here goes down the Arabic stream.
Yeah, I know. So I guess I'm going to translate whatever he is going to say.
It's really
I don't know how to.
very strong with them, saying
Yeah.
that the way how, because they're not paying for more, and they are just like.
Yeah.
So I said you only can do English with Arabic because how could we otherwise provide a good service?
So Mohammed is going to do the translation into English,
But that doesn't go down
and
this line.
and I would hear Mohammed, and then translate back into Arabic. I guess because he's going to be talking either way.
There's only so much you can do. Yeah.
Or I can go silent. I don't know.
No, but when maybe at the time when he translates into English, then you translate into Arabic, because that's the only time anybody on an Arabic stream can hear anything. Yeah, that's the only thing. Sorry, this is not normal, but we are so overbooked today.
I know,
It's
I
very
know.
unusual, so I apologize. It's not the way
Hopefully-
how I like to provide
Hopefully,
service.
the second time we're going to do this, none of these is a good idea. We have to have a special rule.
I told him.
This is
Yeah,
intimidating for the church when we come here.
don't look at it.
Yeah, I mean,
It's only here because all our control rooms are
I
taken.
know, yeah.
Usually we do stuff like that. We have an audio person in a control room, and they monitor the whole time everything. And we did 7 translations for him. Everybody had a monitor. But we had time to prepare. With this, we didn't know till this morning. I didn't know who was that translator. Usually there's going to be a translator. So there was a very. That's the thing. Right. It's just very annoying.
So I'm on all the time here. There's no way go off. Like now we're talking, it's on. All right.
Oh, hold on.
موجودين في القاعة يعني، المفروض تابع الناس، والمفروض هنطلع يعني. آه. مش عارف الصراحة. مش عارف يعني خليني إذا كان موجودين في القاعة.
Hi, I'm Dave Thaler. Yeah. Nice to meet you. Yeah, pleasure. Very good. How are you?
Message last night. I don't know if you got it.
No, I didn't. Yeah.
Told you, but I did.
Okay, good to see you. Yeah, Dave Pollock. Yeah.
Yeah, I read a lot about your work.
Okay. I hope it's good. Yeah.
Yes, it's good.
Okay.
So I'm gonna speak.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Martin's gonna talk. He's the lawyer.
Oh,
Fawzi's
okay. Okay.
Mohamed Fawzi's gonna say his word in Arabic.
Yes.
It's a very
Sure.
brief word.
Yeah.
You have the floor.
Okay.
And then we'll go to Q&A.
Sure.
Did you get a chance to look at the booklet?
I did not actually. No. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
محمد
Okay.
ممكن تجيب لي بوكلت؟
Yeah.
اللينك شغال بتاع الويب سايت عربي وانجليزي لكن انت بعد ايه؟
ناقص الخلدون.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
اسأل خلدون.
تسأل بقى الأسئلة تسأل أسئلة حلوة في حاجات حلوة ديت بص تعالى قاعدة قدام دي Turkish? ايه الأخبار؟ Hey Nick, who's the judge?
The audience.
The audience.
The people. Yeah, the attorneys, the dancers. Yeah. The judge.
Yeah. When I do my initial introduction.
Are you from the Washington Times? No, Huffington Post. Okay. Where are you? You're from the Washington Times. Okay. I'm just because the Twitter avatars are getting a bit confusing here. I identify people by the Twitter accounts. Yeah. Do you know who all these people are? Yeah.
What's that light up there?
Yeah, I know it's bad. TV anchors have it the worst, I guess.
No, it's that light up there.
So when you guys are ready, let us know. So let's see what. Yeah, can you call Madeline because she's gonna run the video before we even start. Khaldun, can you ask her if she's going to run the video and when we're going to start, please?
How long do you have the room for?
Hour and a half. Check, check, check. Is the audio right? خليه يقعد قدام، خليه يقعد قدام. خليه يقعد قدام ناديه، ارفع ايدك. When are we beginning? Are we starting soon? We're going to run the video first. So whenever you run the video, I'm ready. We're ready. Get the audio. Can we start the video again and put the audio, please?
هذا لابد ان الجماعة هي التي ترى انها في حاجة الى هذا الامر. اذا الجماعة عشان يفجر نفسه، هذا لابد ان الجماعة هي التي ترى انها في حاجة الى هذا الامر. اذا الجماعة رأت انها في حاجة الى من يفجر نفسه في الاخرين، ويعني يكون هذا امرا مطلوبا، وتدبر الجماعة كيف يفعل هذا بأقل الخسائر الممكنة، وإذا استطاع أن ينجو بنفسه فليفعل.
Mr. Al-Qaradawi, one may blow himself up only if the Al-Jama'ah needs him to do so. Al-Jama'ah a consensus, and he is the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood group designated as terrorists. If the Al-Jama'ah needs someone to blow himself up into a congregation of people, they must organize the operation with the least casualties if possible, and preferably the bomber should survive too. One must submit to the Al-Jama'ah and not act alone. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the words of Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, who's also known as the godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood group, designated as terrorists. He's an Egyptian fugitive sentenced to death on terrorism charges, who now lives freely in Qatar under the protection of the Al Thani ruling family. The picture you see in front of you, which is of the Emir of Qatar, Tamim Al Thani, kissing the head of Al-Qaradawi, just days after the blockade on Qatar started. This man had a weekly show on Al Jazeera Arabic, which at one time had an estimated audience of 60 million people. there is a difference between freedom of expression and insightful rhetoric that poisons the minds of people and possibly inspire them. We journalists challenge governments all the time with our pens and cameras and take every opportunity to call on world leaders to respect press freedom and refrain from jailing journalists. Just as we expect governments to abide by basic human rights, we also expect news outlets like Al Jazeera to respect the ethics of journalism, stop endangering the lives of its staff, and refrain from sponsoring groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Nusra, an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups. There is a difference between the bias of many TV channels in the media today and the sponsorship of a cause for your own agenda, and in this case, it's Qatar's agenda, and that is why we are here today, and I thank you for coming. I have sued Al Jazeera Media Network in May 2015 in the British Columbia Court for negligence, misrepresentation, and breach of contract only after putting my investigative journalism skills to work in prison and during my time out on bail before returning back to prison again. Both parties have submitted numerous supportive documents. The witnesses will be cross-examined in the near future before the public hearing scheduled for January 2018. We want the case to take place in the fair and honorable Canadian courts, and Al Jazeera wants the trial to take place in Qatar, a nation that secretly tried a poet who wrote a poem praising the Arab Spring and jailed him for close to 4 years, a judicial system that banned Qatar's former Justice Minister, Dr. Najib al-Naimi, from traveling, an arbitrary and unexplained travel ban according to Amnesty International. My defense in the retrial in Egypt was based around attempting to convince the judge to separate between the responsibilities of we journalists and Al Jazeera. My colleagues and I, including cameraman Mohamed Fawzi, did not conspire with the Muslim Brotherhood group designated as terrorists. Al Jazeera did, and on behalf of the Qatari government, who control the general direction of the coverage. My lawyers have collected affidavits from former senior Al Jazeera employees, former members of the Qatari government, including a former Qatari diplomat, and legal experts to corroborate every word in my lawsuit. Allow me to present you with just a small sample of the evidence. Before I joined Al Jazeera English in September 2013, and Mohamed Fawzi was deployed to Egypt, all the Al Jazeera channels illegally used the technology in the Egyptian state TV broadcast truck that was violently stolen by members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Rabaa al-Adawiyya sit-in close to 6 weeks. The following is an excerpt from an official report filed by Mr. Shukri Abu Amera, head of the Board of Trustees of the Egyptian State TV, to the Interior Ministry, the Intelligence, and the Military. He says, quote unquote, on July 4th, 2013, we were surprised that the state TV truck was used to broadcast the Rabaa Adawiyya sit-in to Al-Quds and Al-Aqsa TV channels. For those who don't know, they are Palestinian channels known as mouthpieces for Hamas, a group designated as terrorists by the US, Canada, among other nations. He also says, quote unquote, on July 5th, 2013, we learned that the state TV truck was used to broadcast Rabaa al-Adawiyya on Al Jazeera. The technicians were assaulted by supporters of the former president and kicked out of the sit-in. In the press kit presented to the journalists here, you will find the signed testimony acquired by my Egyptian lawyer, Mohamed Nabawi, from Ahmed Gamal Saeed, a former Al Jazeera English security guard who was present in the sit-in. A brief quote from his affidavit says, when I was working for Al Jazeera English channel in Rabaa protest, which was led by the Muslim Brotherhood, I saw the members of the organization forcibly taking over the Egyptian television car and cooperated with all the channels and journalists of Al Jazeera during the protest and allowed Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera Arabic, and Al Jazeera Mubashir to broadcast live on the air using the technology available in the car. During my trial in Egypt, known as the Marriott cell, I hired my own lawyers. Longtime Al Jazeera lawyer Mr. Farag Fati represented my colleagues Peter Greste and Bahar Mohamed in the case. He abruptly quit in court on May 15th, weeks before our 7-year sentence was announced. He also announced that he had emails that prove Al Jazeera is working against the interest of us journalists in the cage. Mr. Farag also objected to a $150 million compensation claim Al Jazeera filed against the Egyptian government in London and most recently in Washington, D.C. He said the lawsuit could jeopardize the defense's case and impact any sympathetic reaction he might have been able to garner from the court. Did Al Jazeera ask journalists, us, before suing Egypt or even listen to their lawyer? No. Mr. Farag also said, according to quotes published in Agence France Presse, Al Jazeera is using my clients. I have emails from the channel telling me they don't care about the defendants and care about insulting Egypt. During my research, I read and acquired some of these emails. Most shockingly is an email sent from a senior legal counsel at Al Jazeera to Mr. Farag, asking him to represent a Gamal Nassar, a spokesman of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was being tried in absentia at the time by Judge Nagi Shhata, the same judge presiding over our case, but in a separate terrorism trial known as Rabah Operation Room, a trial which included many of the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, including the Supreme Guide Mohamed Badia. The email reads, "Good morning, sir. Mr. Gamal Nassar has recently joined Al Jazeera network and has become one of its employees. The links below indicate that he has been accused in the case known as Rabah Cell, a case that has been investigated by the prosecutor and was referred to Cairo Criminal Court on April 7, 2014. Please read the links and take your procedures to defend him and report to us." They hired a man being tried on terrorism during an ongoing trial. A copy of the original Arabic email is in the press kit distributed to the journalists in this room. When I accepted the job at Al Jazeera English, I asked the managers to separate my work from the Arabic channels in Egypt and allow my team and I to do our own news gathering, sourcing, and booking. They accepted my request. During the course of our work in the Marriott Hotel, they breached their promise and unknowingly to we journalists used our content on the Arabic channels, including Al Jazeera Mubashir, which was shut down by a court order for being biased to the Muslim Brotherhood and a threat to national security. At that point, my colleagues and I were still under the impression that Al Jazeera English was operating legally in Egypt. We asked and asked. The answer was, stick to your duties. We are legal, and we are working from the Marriott Hotel to avoid the backlash of the angry people on the streets. We will be returning to our offices soon. Only in the retrial, after spending 411 days in prison in 2015, did my colleagues and I learn that even Al Jazeera English was operating illegally when the prosecutor submitted a report to that effect. Then my Egyptian lawyer interviewed former Al Jazeera senior accountant. Part of the affidavit is in the press kit reads, "As far as I know, the channel Al Jazeera did not obtain all the necessary licenses for its activity in Egypt. I found out when I visited the media production city to obtain the statements of account. I also learned that the channel's Al Jazeera commercial register had expired due to invalid licenses. Nader Gohar, the co-owner and chairman of CNC, became Al Jazeera's top service provider in Egypt. He provided the channel with equipment, studios, live broadcasting signals, and even reporters and news packages until the channel opened its first office in Cairo. The following are quotes taken from a published report in the Washington-based Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Nader says, "After the January 2011 revolution and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Al Jazeera Network launched Al Jazeera Mubashir Misr. The new channel was granted an initial license by the Investment Ministry, a document that permits the establishment of a media company if 4 conditions are met. declaring a joint company with 30 to 50 million Egyptian pounds of capital, opening the headquarters in Cairo's free trade zone, renting a studio at Cairo's media production city, and renting a channel on Egypt's satellite, Nilesat. But even then, Al Jazeera never met the conditions, said Gohar. They illegally opened broadcast studios outside of the media production city. Their mobile broadcasting units were almost everywhere across Egypt, which requires different permits from security authorities, and their staff were automatically unlicensed after the failure to fulfill the conditions of establishment. Gohar says that Al Jazeera was given a free rein to operate illegally because of their solid relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, who occupied 47.5% of Egypt's parliament in November 2011. Gohar terminated his work with Mubashir Misr only 3 days after its establishment in 2011. He also says, Ayman Gabala, the director of Mubashir Misr, visited me when the channel was launched after the resignation of Hosni Mubarak in 2011, and he didn't hide his affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood or his ideological background. A few days later, the channel hired more than 25 people with solid ties to the Muslim Brotherhood organization, the majority of whom weren't media workers in the first place. So I terminated my agreement with them, but continued to work with the Arabic and English channels. On July 3rd, right after Mr. Morsi's ouster, CNC terminated its agreement with Al Jazeera Arabic channel as well. He says, I was outside of Egypt, and when I watched a live report by Abdel Fattah Fayed, the head of Al Jazeera Arabic channel, claiming that Morsi's supporters took over the security directorate in Asyut, and millions of them are marching in Cairo and elsewhere, I thought that the terrorism of the 90s has returned. It turned out that none of it was true. So I decided to terminate all my work with them. Gohar's decision was followed by the resignation of some 20 Al Jazeera workers, including some of the leading presenters in the protest of the channel's misleading coverage. The Washington Times reported the mass resignation with an article that read, "We aired lies." I interviewed Mr. Nader Gohar myself during my time out on bail, before returning back to prison. He corroborated the information in the article and added, I also learned that some of their Arabic reporters in Egypt had illegally acquired and used live broadcasting equipment smuggled into Egypt through the Hamas-managed tunnels running illegally from Gaza into northern Sinai. He confirmed his testimony to my Egyptian lawyer, Mr. Mohamed Nabawi. It's worth adding here that I personally interviewed Bedouin chiefs in northern Sinai, and not only corroborated this information, but also found out that Ayman Gabala, the former bureau chief of Al Jazeera Mubashir Misr, was smuggled into Gaza through the tunnels in northern Sinai with the help of Hamas and the Bedouins. Gabala is now wanted in Egypt and on terrorism charges and lives freely in Qatar, among many who do. In prison, it was the first time my colleagues and I learned about the underreported Riyadh Agreement. The Emir of Qatar signed on the document, but Qatar failed to honor the conditions of the private accords reached in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia on November 23, 2013, in the presence of key members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The details of the accord were not fully published. We were working at the Marriott Hotel in Egypt at the time. Eventually, I learned that the accords had committed the Qatari Emir to implement changes to Qatar's foreign policies, prevent Muslim Brotherhood members from appearing on Al Jazeera, and he was to review the channel's hypercritical programming of Egypt and the GCC, and refrain from supporting groups designated as terrorists and hosting and sponsoring fugitives, for example, from Bahrain, Saudi, and others like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and members of the Hamas leadership, a group designated as terrorists in the US and Canada, among other nations. Al Jazeera CEO, Chairman Hamad bin Thamer al-Thani, a cousin of the Qatar Emir, must have known about these negotiations, but he chose to ignore them and kept us honest journalists working on the field in Egypt in the dark. The network had received warnings from heads of states and diplomats regarding its operation in Egypt and its support of the Muslim Brotherhood, but chose to put the story ahead of the security of its staff. There's an affidavit in the press kit from a Doha former senior Al Jazeera anchor, and he speaks about the fact that none of the anchors or journalists were informed about the articles of the Riyadh Agreement. In my lawsuit in Canada, one of the main angles I aim to prove to the judge is that the Qatari government controls Al Jazeera's general editorial line. Days ago, the government of Bahrain broadcast 4 phone calls that took place in 2011 at the peak of the anti-government protests, a conversation between Hamad Khalifa Al-Atiyah, the advisor to the Qatari Emir, and Hassan Ali Sultan, a Bahraini opposition member designated as a terrorist. You may read the literal translation of these horrific phone calls in the press kit. I will mention a couple of lines that caught my eye. Hassan Ali says, "I'm talking to you with Abu Khalifa based on your request that I inform you of any information regarding the police forces and the declaration of national emergency. We expect the flow of blood." The Qatari Emir's advisor answers, "Yes, I will immediately carry this story on Al Jazeera. We have no problem to put this out now." The Bahraini man, designated as a terrorist, responds, "The thugs are the forces. They have weapons and are trawling the villages wearing civilian clothes." The guy answers, "Who is the person that I can get Al Jazeera to get in touch with you to get this information? Shall I get them to call you and use an alias? I need 2 minutes to prepare. Get back to me." One comedian put it and said, "Seems that the Emir of Qatar and his advisors are the executive producers of the segments and the programs at Al Jazeera." I wish it were funny, but it is not. Hamad Khalifa Al-Atiyah is also the brother of Abdul Aziz Al-Atiyah, convicted in absentia to 7 years in Lebanon in 2014 for funding Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. He was recently designated as a terrorist by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, among many Qataris with close ties to the Al-Thani family who live freely in Qatar. During the course of my research in prison, I interviewed many Muslim Brotherhood youth who explained to me the extent of the unethical and illegal relationship they had with Al Jazeera. Many of them sold footage to the network that was aired without sourcing or proper vetting. Astonishingly, some even received cameras and broadcast equipment directly from the network or indirectly through the Muslim Brotherhood with the knowledge of the senior managers at the network. Some of the Al Jazeera journalists on the field, like myself and my esteemed colleagues, were not informed of such illegal and unethical practices. It's not citizen journalism, as Al Jazeera likes to call it. It's taking sides in the conflict and endangering the lives of your reporters and becoming part of the struggle rather than just reporting on it. Ali Hashem, a prominent reporter, and 2 other correspondents quit from the Al Jazeera Beirut office in 2012 over the network's bias. In a news report, he said, "Al Jazeera has supplied Syrian rebels with satellite communication tools to ensure telephone and internet connection. The channel paid $50,000 for smuggling phones and other tools across the Syrian border to ensure they would get an inside picture. The channel was taking a stance. It was meddling with each and every detail of reports of the Syrian revolution." Hashem called Al Jazeera's policy information suicide. I was told by my former colleagues at Al Jazeera that Kelly Jarrett, the executive producer of news at Al Jazeera English, instructed the staff to stop referring to Al-Nusra as an Al-Qaeda affiliate. The reality is that Al-Qaeda isn't the organization it used to be. That's what the email says. How could you normalize a brutal and more murderous organization like Al-Qaeda? Poor Kelly. She must have received that call from the executive producer at the Qatar's Emir's office. It must have been that. The reality is that Qatar does not consider Al-Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda as terrorists. In fact, many of Qataris designated as terrorists by the US and the UN for funding such extremists for many years with millions of dollars are living freely in Qatar. They're on Twitter, some of them. And that's the main reason for the Qatar blockade and the Gulf Rift today. It is a dangerous time for Al Jazeera staff, and I hope none of my former colleagues have to go through what Peter Greste, Bahir Mohamed, and myself went through in that terrorism wing. Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Mr. Martin McMahon. He represents my colleague Mohamed Fawzi.
First of all, thank you all for coming. And I'll try to follow the very solid act. Elvis Presley was once asked, whose act does he not want to follow? And he said, Roy Orbison. So it's always difficult to follow up on an excellent speaker who has exposed, thank God, all of the financial international terrorism that Qatari leaders and Al Jazeera officials are financing. I'm the principal managing partner of the Transnational Business Attorneys Group, and we've done a lot of interesting work over the last 30 years to represent indigent people, folks like my colleague here, who can't find a competent attorney to really advance his cause because everybody's so expensive. We have represented Muslims murdered in Bangladesh. We had to file a criminal complaint in the International Criminal Court. We've sued Prime Minister Netanyahu for war crimes and other leaders. We've sued 5 different countries for treating their citizens in a disgusting and undemocratic manner. We have represented Palestinians who have been expelled from their homeland. Most people don't know it, but 400,000 Palestinians have been forcibly evicted from the occupied territories. It's called denationalization of a civilian population, and it's a war crime. We have represented civilian Iraqis, Chinese dissidents, and Americans who have been tortured, brutally tortured overseas, much like the young man from Ohio who came back in a comatic state and is now expired. We need to do things about that. But in any case, I want to follow up on my colleague's comments. I want to first of all thank him for inviting me for this opportunity. It's really special. And this press conference, you don't know, it may become historic, and I'll explain why. I also want to commend him for preparing the incredible dossier that you have in front of you. You know what it is? It's a criminal indictment. And that's how I practice law in New York City, where I'm from. Did a lot of criminal work. It's a criminal indictment against Qatari leaders and the Muslim Brotherhood leaders for sponsoring international terrorism. Now, international terrorism is a term that's kicked around by a lot of people, and I thought I might try to educate you a little bit about something. But President Clinton, in 1995, issued an executive order which banned the promotion or financing of terrorism in the Middle East. There's recently been enacted a statute called JASTA, which nobody knows about, I think, but it's called the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorist Activity. And what it does, and it should raise a cautionary red flag for the Qatari government, it strips governments of immunity when they sponsor international terrorism. And we've been involved in JASTA cases before. It also violates the international UN covenant on financing terrorism. Now, what's the results of that? Rex Tillerson is no doubt meeting today and tomorrow with his officials to determine what the consequences are of the proof now put forward by my colleague that Al Jazeera and Qatari officials, including the Emir, have been sponsors of international terrorism for a long time. It's all detailed in this dossier, and that's why I think it's going to be an historic document. But Rex will be told that, well, you can use the OFAC division in Treasury to designate them as a specially designated global terrorist. As a result of that, their properties located on Park Avenue or in London can be foreclosed upon. Their bank accounts will be closed. So it's quite a serious situation. Treasury Department also has the authority to designate people, and that's why they'll be in the negotiations. And all of you know that I believe Saudi Arabia deserves a big thank you for exposing the sponsorship and criminalization of terrorist financing by Qatari leaders and the Muslim Brotherhood. What's going to happen? Who knows? But all of you do know that we have a naval base in Qatar, and in all likelihood, therefore, they won't be designated as criminals or terrorists because of political considerations. It'll be interesting to see how the Trump administration plays this out. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is Mr. McMahon here? So, I'm not a potted plant. I represent this gentleman right here. Comes to me last year, and I forget how he learns about me, but fortunately I have some of these, shows circulate in the Middle East, and somebody says, "Oh, who is that guy?" So he tells me a story that, being an Irishman, gets me, emotionally. Now, he is in Cairo, arrives about 3 or 4 days after revocation of Al Jazeera's licenses and broadcast permits. In other words, he's in the country illegally. And some of you, I don't know, most of you probably know what an Egyptian prison is like. Maybe it's at an 8 and North Korea's at a 10, but it's bad. So before he leaves, based upon his 10-year relationship and the warmth and support he has of senior officials at Al Jazeera, he says, "What is this deal up to, What's the story, as we say in New York City? What's the story?" "Well, we want you to go to Cairo. You're the best cameraman we have. You've got a great coordinator with you. Things are happening there, and we should be covering them. After all, we're Al Jazeera, the broadcast unit that covers stories nobody else does." It'll be funny how they're going to broadcast their own story this time. But anyway, he asked them some questions which are basic, like, do we have all the requisite permits, and do we have all the requisite licenses? And they assured him repeatedly, yes. So if he didn't get that assurance, as we say in our lawsuit, he never would have gone to Cairo. I mean, who wants to see the inside of an Egyptian cell? Now, because he received those assurances, he went there and eventually finds out, because of this man's diligent efforts, not only do they not have broadcast licenses and they're in the country illegally, they're actually staging news. I mean, I don't like Mr. Trump at all, but the one thing we agree upon is that sometimes news is staged. Fake news, I think he calls it. Well, Mr. Gohar, as our colleague related to you, is sitting in a hotel room outside of his country, and he tunes in the international news. And lo and behold, millions of Muslim Brotherhood adherents, much like rodents in New York City, are raging through Cairo. Well, this turns out to be a complete fabrication. So what he didn't know in that crucial meeting before he commits to Cairo is that not only do you guys not have licenses, you're staging news, mostly in cooperation with the Muslim Brotherhood. So again, doing that in Cairo is like facing some potential injury. Now, had he known at some stage when he's there that they're staging news, he would have gone on the first plane and gotten the hell out of there. Fortunately, he had the opportunity to do that because he had a visa application pending at the embassy, the U.S. Embassy. So he was arrested, and the next morning goes to the embassy fortuitously, picks up his passport, and gets the hell out of Cairo. It's like getting out of Dodge, man. This is a bad place for me. So what happens as a result, and why did we file a lawsuit? The first component of our lawsuit is what I'm telling you. The legal theory is promissory estoppel. I could promise to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, but since I don't have authority to do that, you couldn't rely upon that. But here are senior Al Jazeera officials who've been around the block, and they are telling him material misrepresentations, which he relies on to go to Cairo. So we're suing for that. And then also the fact that he's being accused of being an international terrorist. You see, if you work for Al Jazeera, you are deemed to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood, as you know, they don't have a great track record in terms of human rights. And anyway, they violate, as I said, a number of statutes, but they promote violence in the Middle East. And had he known that he was going to become part of a messaging or broadcasting service that would be promoting violence in the Middle East, my man would have nothing to do with it. He has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. He's a great cameraman who almost lost his life in Afghanistan because the Taliban were closing in. He served Al Jazeera very well, and he's been rewarded with what? As we say in New York, forget the Jewish term, but it'll come to me. Anyway, he gets nothing. So he comes to America because Al Jazeera says, listen, come to America. We got a job for you. You know, we take care of our people. BS. When he's in America, he discovers he no longer has a job. He no longer has a valid immigration status. In other words, he's a man without a country, a man without a family. And he is being ridiculed all over the world as an international terrorist. Can you imagine when you board an airplane and guy sees your passport and says, well, you're an international terrorist, you're going to jail. And he couldn't afford to go back to the Middle East to work because of Gulf treaties would require extradition to Egypt. He received a 10-year sentence, much like my colleague here. I don't believe he was pardoned like you, but he has to carry that stigma around. And do you ever have a 12-year-old kid say to your dad, well, why are you an international terrorist? What did you do? So he has that stigma. So we decided to include in the lawsuit certain causes of action, they're called, and we hope that Al Jazeera will come to its senses and eventually settle this case. Because I think it has implications, as I said, because of the incredible proof that is in this dossier. That's prima facie proof in legalese that Qatari officials and Al Jazeera officials have been financing terrorism in the Middle East and broken maybe 7 federal criminal statutes here and other international covenants. So what's going to happen? It'll be up to Rex Tillerson, I guess, to advise the Donald on what they do, but they could be designated. Anyway, thanks for your time. I appreciate it. I'm available for questions, much like my colleagues. So.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much.
عملت كمصور صحفي لأكثر من عقدين في تغطية أهم الأحداث بالعالم خلال تاريخنا المعاصر بكل أمانة مع قنوات أمريكية وأوروبية وعربية، ولم أفكر يوما في نشر أخبار كاذبة أو التحيز لقضية بعينها، لأني أحترم مهنتي كمصور صحفي وأعتبرها جزء لا يتجزأ من أي مجتمع ديمقراطي ناجح. فأنا ضد أي حبس أي صحفي في العالم، خاصة أن هناك المئات من الصحفيين محبوسين حاليا بدون أي ذنب ويجب إخلاء سبيلهم. لكن بعد التحقيق الاستقصائي الذي ركزنا فيه أنا ومحمد فهمي والعديد من المحامين، تأكدنا بالأدلة أن الجزيرة كذبت علينا، وأنها كانت تعلم أن عملنا بمصر كان غير قانوني، وأنها لم تكن فقط منحازة لجماعة إرهابية، لكنها أيضا أمدتهم بكاميرات وأموال وأجهزة بث، مما يتعارض مع مفاهيم الصحافة النزيهة وصحافة المواطن، وأيضا مخالف للقوانين المصرية. أنا الآن أعيش بعيد عن أبنائي وزوجتي وتحت ضغط نفسي وظروف قاسية، ولا أستطيع الرجوع إلى وطني. أيضا لا أستطيع مباشرة عملي بحرية، حيث تم توقيفي بتركيا وترحيلي إلى الدوحة وبعدها طلبت من إدارة الجزيرة تحويلي للعمل بواشنطن لتفادي مخاطر السفر والتنقل في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. وفوجئت عند وصولي لواشنطن أن القناة لم تكمل أوراقي الرسمية وتأشيرة العمل بطريقة شرعية، وتنصلت من كافة التزاماتها معي، وحاولت التحايل علي وإجباري على التعاقد مع شركة أمريكية تقدم خدمات لقنوات الجزيرة. وبعد محاولات عديدة للتواصل وشرح موقفي فشلت جميعها، لجأت للإعلام وعينت محامي لمقاضاة قناة الجزيرة على كل الأضرار التي سببتها شبكة الجزيرة لي ولأسرتي، وتقدمت بطلب لجوء سياسي للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لأحمي نفسي وأسرتي وأتفادى ترحيلي حيث ينتظرني تنفيذ الحكم القضائي ومستقبل غامض. شكرا.
I'd like to introduce Mr. David Pollock, former State Department Senior Advisor for the broader Middle East.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be here. I do want to say, starting out, that I am not a party to this lawsuit. I have no special information about it, and I'm not associated with it. Nor am I associated in any way with any of the other lawsuits that the law firm in question has pursued. I am here as an academic analyst to talk to you a little bit about Al Jazeera based on my research over many years. And so let me just say a word about my own background, and then I'll get right to the point. I am a fluent speaker, although not a native speaker, of Arabic. I have a PhD from Harvard University in political science and Middle East studies. I was, for a decade in the 1980s, mid-1980s until the mid-1990s, the chief of Near East research at the U.S. Information Agency, which specializes in media and public opinion analysis, and then a Middle East expert on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and a senior advisor, as you just heard, for the broader Middle East at the State Department from 1996 until 2007. For the last 10 years, I've been a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And as soon as I got out of the government, I was free to go on TV. And I did. I enjoyed it, and I still do. And I have been a frequent guest on just about every single Arabic channel and many, many other television channels around the world in various languages, but for purposes of this discussion, including Al Jazeera. So the notes that I am reading from are in this little Al Jazeera notebook, which was presented to me as a memento of my visit to Al Jazeera's headquarters in Doha 2 years ago as a guest of the Arab Studies Center in Doha, the capital of Qatar. And as recently as about 3 weeks ago, I was the live color commentator in Arabic on Al Jazeera for their coverage of the Riyadh summit from their studio right here in Washington, D.C. So I'm very, very familiar, both as an academic analyst, as a government official, and as a participant on television. I am very, very familiar with Al Jazeera, right from its inception until today. And with that background in mind, I want to say a few words about it. One is, I want to emphasize, as you may have already heard actually from one of our panelists this morning, that if you want to understand Al Jazeera, it's very important not to lump English Al Jazeera together with Arabic Al Jazeera. These are two different organizations. They sometimes follow the same editorial line and the same managerial direction, but sometimes they differ quite significantly. So English speakers cannot understand what Al Jazeera as a whole is really all about if all they do is watch Al Jazeera English or read the English website of Al Jazeera. You need to do it in Arabic in order to get the full picture. And this is very similar, and I've done research and published scholarly articles about this. This is very similar, actually, not by coincidence, I think, to the modus operandi of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. When during and after the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, 2012, and 2013, until they lost power, put out websites in Arabic and in English that were very different. They were both Muslim Brotherhood websites, but the English website was full of articles about tolerance, about democracy, about things like that, none of which appeared on the Arabic website of the same organization, which was about Sharia and about the victory of Islam and about the instrumental use of democracy in order to take power and keep power no matter what. And that is, in its own rough way, a kind of analog to the differences between English Al Jazeera on the one hand and Arabic Al Jazeera on the other hand. Now, having said that, I want to say that there are some good programs on Al Jazeera, especially the ones that I'm on, but not only. But not only. Some of the programs are good, and some aren't. And I'm talking now about Arabic. Forget English. For example, there's a program on Al Jazeera Arabic called Min Washington, from Washington, which is actually a pretty good show. And I like the moderator, Abdurrahim Al-Fuqara. And I'm on this show pretty often, and what they do is what Al Jazeera started to do when it began, which is to present different points of view, to actually have different panelists representing different points of view, arguing with each other on a program, and representing value added for journalism, for freedom of the press, for diversity of views. So there are programs like that on Al Jazeera. But then there are other programs on Al Jazeera that are completely biased. For example, during the Iraq War from 2003 to 2011, there was a program moderated by Jassim Al-Azawi called Ain Ala Al-Iraq. And I was occasionally a guest on that program. So I know very well what I'm talking about. And this program was totally biased, not just against the United States and its policy in Iraq, but against Iraqi democracy and actually in favor of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam Hussein's version of Iraq. And then there's a program about Palestine, which I've also been a guest on, whose moderator, Ghada El-Awais, is totally biased, not just in favor of the Palestinians and against Israel and against American policy, but in favor of Hamas and against the Palestinian Authority. And then, of course, there are the programs of Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Sharia wa Hayat, which have in the past, as you saw, documented here earlier, supported suicide bombers, not just against Israelis, but against American soldiers in Iraq, very explicitly so. Broadcast on Al Jazeera and over again, every week, and giving Islamic, so-called Islamic religious legitimacy to those acts of terrorism and murder. That is more characteristic of Al Jazeera today, this kind of bias, than its programming when it started out, when it really was, back in the 1990s, relative to other Arabic broadcasting, a voice of diversity, of a free press, of questioning authority, and even stretching a little bit, possibly one could make the argument of democracy. That is not the case of Al Jazeera any time in the last number of years. Now, let me talk about the issue of political pressure and Qatari government control over the content of Al Jazeera. There are many cases that I'm directly familiar with in which that kind of political pressure was exercised. One little known but very, I think, instructive case that I wrote an article about happened at the beginning of the Arab Spring, and in particular at the beginning of the Syrian uprising in 2011. Believe it or not, when the Syrian uprising started, Al Jazeera was pro-Assad, not pro-Syrian opposition. Because in the beginning, the Qatari government believed in the Assad regime as a supporter of Hamas, which it was, and which Qatar also supported and continues to support to this day, and believed some of its own conspiracy theories that the Syrian uprising was actually some kind of not popular uprising against a ruthless dictator, but some kind of Zionist conspiracy or American effort to weaken the Syrian regime. So for a few months in early 2011, Al Jazeera was actually against the Syrian opposition. It called them mutamaridin, rebels, not mu'arada, not opposition, not a kind of legitimate opposition to the nizam, to the regime. And then suddenly, and when I say suddenly, I mean from one day to the next, I watched as Al Jazeera shifted its coverage, changed its terminology in response to political pressure from the Qatari government, responding, I think, although it's difficult to prove or to document, responding, I think, to political pressure from some of its Gulf neighbors. Suddenly, Al Jazeera changed its coverage and began to support not the Assad regime, but the Syrian opposition, including the most fundamentalist, the most extreme, the most actually terrorist elements of that opposition. Something similar happened in 2014, and you've heard about that secret agreement between the Qatari government and Al Jazeera on the one hand, and some of its Gulf Arab neighbors on the other hand, for Al Jazeera once again to switch the tone and the content of its coverage for political reasons. And today, and I just looked at the Arabic website this morning, if you look at Al Jazeera today, you will see that once again they have switched their tone and their coverage in the following way. There is continued but muted criticism of the Saudi and the Emirati governments. There is virulent continued criticism of the Egyptian government because Qatar, the government, and therefore Al Jazeera, is not afraid of Egypt, more afraid of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. There is less criticism than usual of Al Jazeera's usually anti-American bias, less of that than in recent months, because, again, the Qatari government and therefore Al Jazeera is hoping for American intervention on its side, or at least some kind of balanced American intervention against the pressures coming from the GCC, the other GCC members. There is continued strong support of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Sheikh Qaradawi, and of Hamas. And finally, there is a great emphasis in Al Jazeera right now on self-protection, on articles about its own so-called virtue in its own eyes, about experts, so-called experts from around the world, including, I'm sorry to say, the New York Times, testifying on behalf of Al Jazeera and its supposed role in supporting freedom of the press. That accounts, by a rough measure, if you look at the Al Jazeera Arabic website today, for I would say about 25% of the total content is about Al Jazeera. It's Al Jazeera, about why it's such a good thing. But in fact, my conclusion, based on all of this analysis, and again, without reference to the specifics of the lawsuit, my conclusion is that anything about Al Jazeera is not about a free press, because Al Jazeera never was and still is not free. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. And I would actually like to start the Q&A sessions, but because we're going live on the air, so I'd like everybody to come into this mic, so this way we can have the question on camera and on the microphone. So if you can line up here, and please state your name and where you work for, who you work for, and the question, and who you're directing the question to. Thanks.
شكرا جزيلا. خالد خيري، مراسل قناة الغد في واشنطن. سؤال لمحمد وسؤال لمحمد وسؤال ديفيد، بس بسرعة يعني. محمد. I prefer in Arabic because we are on. Okay, I can translate it, but we are on. محمد، يعني من واقع خبرتك كصحفي في قناة الجزيرة، ازاي الجزيرة قدرت تقنع المجتمع العربي بشكل عام انها صادقة، وزي ما بيقول ديفيد بولوك انها الرأي والرأي الآخر، ازاي قدرت تحط السم في العسل للناس؟ بالنسبة لمحمد، اللي تطلبه من، انت مظلوم وقضيتك واضحة، اللي تطلبه من القيادة المصرية علشان يعني تعفو عنك فيما يتعلق بالقضية، واحنا زمايلك كلنا صحفيين عارفين انك انت تم التغرير بيك، وانك انت مصري وطني وضد الاخوان وضد قناة الجزيرة. ديفيد بولوك، الى اي مدى؟
Can I translate that one first?
لا.
He understands Arabic.
ديفيد بولوك، الى اي مدى الاموال القطرية تنفق على مراكز بحثية امريكية، ويعني تؤثر عليك انت شخصيا فيما يتعلق بان تقول الجزيرة قد تكون لها برامج والرأي والرأي الآخر، الى اي مدى تؤثر الاموال القطرية هنا في الولايات المتحدة؟
Okay, so the question he asked Mr. Khalid from Al Ghad TV in Egypt, he asked Mohamed Fahmy, how did Al Jazeera manage to convince the world and everybody else that they are very democratic or professional media network? And the second part of his question, seeing him as a patriotic Egyptian person, how does he expect the Egyptian government to help him out?
Al Jazeera is a network that operates with an open budget. Money is not a problem. I've interviewed, and that's how it has so many resources in comparison to other networks, which helps in establishing many of their news programs and so on. I've interviewed one of the founding members of Al Jazeera while I was writing my book, and he specifically mentioned that the network was established in '96 to basically compete with NBC of Saudi Arabia and to have a presence for the Qatari government on the international arena. So a lot of what you see is a network that is translating what is happening in the Qatari palace. It started off, and I've said this before, in an interesting manner in changing the political, media environment in the Arab world. And many of the good journalists and friends of mine worked there. And somewhere along the way, it drifted. And we saw that very obviously in the Arabic channels when it started taking on the Islamic drift, if I can use that term. And I think a lot of that started with when its director general, who is a member and affiliated with Hamas, took over the operation, and I think that's when it started getting into trouble. In the U.S., they bought the company from Al Gore, which was Current TV. They spent around $2 billion, and they've only garnered about 35,000 subscribers to watch the channel before they got into trouble. The lawyer was allegedly operating without a license. They got lawsuits from Ms. Shannon Basilique and Mr. Matthew Luke in New York and Los Angeles, and they had to shut down the channel. And of course, there's so many stories and lawsuits we can discuss for days when it comes to Al Jazeera, but they will still go out and say that we are the most watched channel, despite the fact that more than 10 bureaus have been shut before Egypt shut the Al Jazeera office in 2013, while we were working in the Marriott unknowingly and being very professional and thinking that we were under a legal umbrella, and in reality we were thrown under the bus and we were lied to and kept in the dark. Thank you.
ما أطلبه من القيادة السياسية في مصر الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي هو عفو رئاسي يسمح لي بالعودة لبلدي. أنا بقالي 4 سنوات بعيد عن بلدي، ما شفتش لا أهلي ولا بيتي ولا أولادي. لم أقوم بأي خطأ نهائي ضد بلدي، وكنت أتمنى أني أحتفل زي ملايين المصريين بعد 30 يونيو بتنصيب الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي، لكن احتفلت لوحدي في البرازيل. كنت شايل علم مصر وماشي في الشوارع هناك. وفي الانتخابات انتخبت الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي في السفارة المصرية في اليمن رغم ان كان طالع حكم عليا، لكن ده واجبي الوطني. كل ما أطلبه هو العفو الرئاسي.
Mr. Mohamed, Fawzi is requesting a presidential pardon from the Egyptian government, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Especially, he's saying despite the fact he had a judgment, he was sentenced to prison for 10 years, he had to flee to Brazil, and he actually celebrated the June 30th revolution there, and he matter of fact, voted for President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, so he believes that the new regime in Egypt is the right regime for Egypt, and that's why he feels like he should go back after 4 years, not seeing his family, his kids. He wants to go back to his own country.
Thank you for the question.
Do you mind if you repeat it? So
yeah, I'm sorry, that's right, it wasn't translated.
Yes.
The question was about the influence of Qatari money on issues and debate and in Washington, D.C., think tanks, yes, and my own personal experience with that. So I will say I'm not really here to talk about that. I spoke about that on Sky News Arabia last week, and you can probably find that interview on YouTube or someplace. I doubt whether after today I'll be speaking about this on Al Jazeera again anytime soon. But I will say that it's well known that their Qatari money has contributed to, for example, think tanks in Washington, but not my think tank.
Which think tank?
Well, again, it's public on the record that this is true of Brookings and I think also of others, including, for example, they have their own think tank now, the Arab Studies Center right here in Washington, D.C., which is a kind of a satellite of the Doha Center, where I spoke at a conference a couple of years ago and got this nice little notebook. And I don't know about others. I don't follow that. That's not my expertise, but there may be others as well. But what I can say is that my own think tank, and I personally, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Dr. David Pollack, does not get any foreign money, not 1 penny of foreign money, not from Qatar, not from any other foreign country, company, or private individual. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy is funded entirely by contributions from American citizens or foundations, and no government, no corporate, no foreign money comes to me or to my think tank. Now, I want to say one other quick comment about Al Jazeera's influence, since you also asked about that. From what I can see, again, as an analyst, not as a partisan, in the beginning, Al Jazeera had a reputation for being new and fresh and relatively free, and had a lot of influence and a lot of popularity. But that's been on the decline for quite a number of years now. And by now, today, by many measures, Al Jazeera is still quite popular and influential, but it no longer has that kind of first among equals, or way out ahead of others in Arab broadcasting. There are many competitors, including especially Al Arabiya and Sky News Arabia, just measured in terms of audience share. And local television channels have also gained in popularity, especially in places like Egypt or Iraq. And so I think Al Jazeera's audience, its access, its reputation, and overall its impact or influence on the region and in the world have declined. And too many Americans, and maybe others, I think, are still laboring under an outdated impression that Al Jazeera is somehow the flagship of Arab broadcasting and sort of above and beyond all the rest in terms of its value, its added value. And that's not true anymore.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I fell short in making sure that the answer would be within a minute, hopefully, so we can give more chances to other people too.
My name is Namo Abdullah. I'm a journalist with Rudao. It's a Kurdish news agency. So my question to the journalist who was detained in Egypt. So you believe that one of the major reasons for your detention is that Al Jazeera didn't have proper licensing or paperwork to operate in Egypt. So my question is, if Al Jazeera did everything right, had everything that the Egyptian government required it from Al Jazeera, would that have made a difference for you? Because it seems to me that Egypt, as like any other authoritarian government, use that as an excuse to arrest you, because it doesn't really need, an authoritarian government doesn't need an actual reason to put people behind bars. Egypt has indeed arrested a lot of legitimate, registered journalists and civil society activists. Thank you.
Good question. In your classification of authoritarian government, that's your classification, but I'll respond to your question. We were probably one of the first journalists accused of terrorism. There are journalists in Egyptian prison. Some of them are not registered as journalists. They are citizen journalists. The problem with what Al Jazeera did, I mean, I worked for CNN for 3 years in Egypt and other channels as well. The problem with Al Jazeera is not just the issue of the licenses. I mean, if you look at our sentence, we were part of the sentence was for licenses. But even if Al Jazeera was all good on paper, the issue of conspiring with a group that is banned, then declared as terrorists, whether you in Qatar and Al Jazeera believe they're terrorists or not, doesn't matter. The country where you're working at are telling you these guys are terrorists. So if I was told, and Peter Greste and Bahir Mohamed, sitting in the Marriott, that Al Jazeera was dealing very fluidly with many members of the Brotherhood, whether they're the youth, and so on, and we accepted that, then I would not be able to speak about it or contest it. But we weren't. And unfortunately, I found out inside the prison, not only from interviewing a lot of these Muslim Brotherhood members and youth, who in their minds, they're doing what they want to do. That's their business. I'm a journalist. If you put me with these guys and you don't tell me about it, then I'm coming after you. So the point is here that Al Jazeera, and through our research that I've been doing day and night, didn't just do this in Egypt. They did it in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, because they were not getting enough access. So instead of operating with the norms and ethics of what a channel should do, they decided to cross the line with that meaning of citizen journalism. And unfortunately, I think the network has destroyed the noble meaning of citizen journalism by dealing with activists and fighters and members of what they call rebels, and making it really bad for their professional journalists like us and other journalists on the field, and basically endangering the lives of many journalists today. So they need to be accountable for that. I have spoken about it even when I was in prison, and I've asked the network to submit a document to the court in Egypt saying that we take responsibility for the licenses so that we can get a break in the court. But they didn't. They did everything wrong. They hired a lawyer that turned against us in court. They decided that they're going to use our English material on the Arabic channel that is officially banned by the administrative court for being, quote unquote, biased to the Brotherhood and a national security threat. So they are knowingly putting us in danger. I don't think any decent network like CNN or others would even begin to accept doing this to their journalists. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Kasım İler. I am with Anadolu Agency, the Turkish news agency. I have a question for Mohamed, and I will ask a question to the Polak. During your research about Al Jazeera and developing your case against the channel, have you consulted with any Emirati, Bahraini, or Saudi officials in Washington? Also, there are some allegations that you have some connections and good relations with Yusuf Al Otaiba of United Arab Emirates, the ambassador of United Arab Emirates in Washington. Could you clarify this? And just a short question to Mr. Polak about his notebook. It's a cute notebook. he twice he mentioned it. How does it feel to have a notebook with the logo of a channel which you are also accusing for promoting terrorism? Thank you.
Well, to simply answer your question, no. Thank you.
I want to be, I'm not accusing Al Jazeera of promoting terrorism in the legal sense. That's not for me to judge, right? We have legal standards here about material support for terrorism, which is different from that is providing actual support for terrorism as opposed to advocating it or supporting organizations that practice terrorism but only verbally. So I want to be clear about that. However, in direct response to your question, I feel fine having this notebook. I think that it testifies to not to my affinity for Al Jazeera, but to my familiarity with it, my deep personal record of contact and study of this network for many years. That's what the notebook is for.
Next.
Hi, I'm Laura Kelly from the Washington Times for Mr. Fahmy, Mr. Fawzi. Can you talk about how you viewed the announcement of the blockade on Qatar by the GCC countries? How does it relate to your case? Do you think it legitimizes it? Does it have no effect?
Well, it didn't come as a surprise because some of these measures that were taken against Qatar were actually discussed in the secret accords of the Riyadh Agreement before. And I feel, just as a journalist and someone looking at it from the outside, that Qatar has been given so many chances and they've been warned so many times. And when it was announced, I wasn't really in shock. You know, this is when a nation has scores of designated terrorists by the U.S., the UN, like Mr. Abdurrahman bin Omer, the head of the former head of the Qatari Football Association, who's, according to the U.S. Department, spending $2 million a month on ISI in Iraq and Al-Qaeda, and others who are running around, and your neighbors. I don't know how I would be able to live if I would have to deal with that, if I had a neighbor like that. So it wasn't a surprise at all. I think somebody's got to put an end to this because a lot of this money goes to the people who kill our friends, journalists, all over Syria and Iraq. And I've lost many friends on the field that I really respected, who were kidnapped and killed. Egyptian soldiers, Iraqi soldiers, and so on. So somebody has to put an end to it. As far as does it affect my case? My case is a case that is not affected by what happens in Qatar. I am fighting my case against Al Jazeera for very legitimate concerns and with lots of evidence, and I'm going to continue to fight this case for as long as it takes, because I really think that not only does Al Jazeera need to be accountable, but I worry for my friends at the network who still work there for their own safety. Thank you.
Thanks for doing this. Josh Letterman with the Associated Press. First, for the attorney, could you just explain how the U.S. District Court in D.C. has any jurisdiction over what happened in Egypt? And then more broadly, I mean, you guys keep bringing up, Secretary Tillerson and special terrorist designations and evidence of Qatari influence on editorial direction and things that have really nothing to do with your negligence claim or, whether or not the channel was licensed in Egypt. So is it fair to say that the lawsuit is more of a vehicle to build public momentum for this effort by these other countries to try to isolate Qatar and to shut down the network? Not at all. This case, I started researching my case when I was in my cell, before any of this whole mess started. And I filed the lawsuit officially in May 2015. So I have nothing to do with what's happening in the Gulf and so on. But I am mentioning the Riyadh Agreement specifically because we were in that Marriott hotel when it was first signed, and we were not told that this Riyadh Agreement was being even discussed. And it affects us directly as journalists, because if you have Arab countries telling Qatar, stop hypercritical programming of your neighbors and stop hosting leaders of Muslim Brotherhood, and we're being told on the field to continue to do that, and we're not given any warnings, forget about the licenses and all that, I'm talking about that specific political aspect of it all, then yes, I will mention it and I will discuss it, because it is a major factor of how we were left in the dark. Thank you. And about the jurisdiction?
Yes. To the extent a foreign country, a foreign government, a foreign corporation, or an individual avails himself of the benefits of this jurisdiction, the court can decide that that's enough for you in terms of being subjected to jurisdiction. For example, if Al Jazeera is doing business in the District of Columbia, and keep in mind, it's made zillions of dollars from its business dealings in the District of Columbia. They just don't want to be sued here. So the attorneys for Al Jazeera, a very good firm, and Al Jazeera always hires these great firms, it seems, they have alleged that the court does not have jurisdiction because we don't do business here. Now, Al Jazeera, much like other multinational corporations I've had to deal with, they set up these little corporations here and there because they turn around and say to the court, well, we don't do business there. So they have a very unique way of avoiding lawsuits. So I'd love to ask them one day, well, where do you want to be sued other than Doha, of course? So that's a quick analysis on jurisdiction. They have a pending motion to dismiss for lack of jurisdiction. The court, I think, is going to allow us to conduct what we call jurisdictional discovery. If you don't know it, up on 1333 New Hampshire Avenue, that's where Al Qaeda is.
Al Jazeera.
Okay. Well, they may be there. So to the extent you are playing games with subsidiaries and corporations, I saw a judge slam somebody in a situation like, you have 14 corporations, you know? Isn't it about time you face justice here? So I don't know what the judge is going to do, but if we get some jurisdictional discovery, we can probe exactly what you're doing in the District of Columbia and how much money you're making, and that may impress a judge to say, you know what, I'm going to let the case go forward. Let the case go forward. Does that answer your question?
Sure.
Amy Schwartz from Moment Magazine. This question is really a follow-up on Mr. Pollack's reflections on the trajectory of Al Jazeera from its early days to its sort of less pro-democratic, less influential and significant profile now. Mr. Fahmy may want to address this as well. Because of all that we've heard about the pressure from the countries to possibly shut down Al Jazeera, I would be curious if you could reflect on whether, supposing Al Jazeera was in fact shut down, if it ceased to be, what would be the overall effect on the region? Would you consider that a net positive, a net negative?
Go ahead, sir.
I would say that personally, I would rather that Al Jazeera owned up to its transgressions and corrected them rather than be shut down completely. I think that would be a better outcome. I would also point out that Qatar has, as with everything else that the Qatari government does, they have hedged their bets on this one by also starting to fund or to acquire outright other media outlets, just in case, because they understood long before this lawsuit or the current GCC internal dispute, they understood that Al Jazeera was losing influence and audience and reputation, and for very good reasons. And so the Qatari government went ahead and through front companies and other intermediaries bought out, for example, Al-Quds Al-Arabi, which is a major I mean, this is very inside the Beltway or inside the Arab Beltway stuff. It's an important expatriate pro-Hamas newspaper published in London. And the Qatari government also started up other television channels in London and other places. Some of the people that were associated with Al Jazeera migrated, and I'm not saying that this was direct Qatari government influence, but in fact their views are well represented, and Qatari government policy is well represented by individuals who have migrated to other media outlets, including Huffington Post Arabic, in recent years. So if Al Jazeera were shut down, which, as I said, I don't advocate, I think that's too drastic. But the net effect would be offset to some extent by these other Qatari-based or supported or influenced media outlets over time.
Net effect for Qatar, that sounds like.
What
about
for the whole? Well, for the region,
landscape?
for the region as a whole. Yeah, right. Yeah.
One of the main demands that have been stated in the RIF today, and it's not an official demand on the table, but many journalists and experts in the field know that the countries that have implemented the blockade want to shut down the network. I believe, personally, that if Al Jazeera is not shut down, then maybe we should start seeing the voices of the Qataris on the network and members of the opposition, like the head of the opposition who's been on many channels these days, Khaled El-Hayl and Mona Al-Salaiti, and the diaspora of Qataris that are in London and everywhere else, who I see them on Twitter all day trying to get a voice in there. You know, you say you're the opinion and the other opinion. I call it the opinion and the no Qatari opinion. You'll never see on Al Jazeera anything about the lack of press freedom or non-existent of political parties or labor unions, nothing about the education and, the many stories that you see in the Western press about the treatment of those laborers building the stadiums for the World Cup. So if we really have to live with Al Jazeera, maybe we should just get a little bit of what's happening in that country and get some real journalism going on.
Hey, Safan, Anadolu Agency, and I have a question for David. You said you went and visit Al Jazeera headquarters, yes, and you joined many programs at Al Jazeera TV.
Yes.
But now here you say Al Jazeera is completely biased and supports terrorism, right?
No.
So that's what you said. That's
no,
what you said.
I didn't say that.
You said biased.
But I said biased. Yeah, I didn't say completely biased, and I said it supports.
Okay, you say it's biased and has ties with terrorist organizations.
It supports That's right.
Okay. Right. So did you know all of these while you were attending these TV programs at Al Jazeera TV?
Absolutely, of course. Yeah, but I thought that I could.
Then why did you attend? Just like using the book.
Yeah, because I thought that since they let me say whatever I wanted to say, I thought that, and I think this is true, that at least I could provide some balance to the rest of Al Jazeera's programming. And in fact, the programs that I usually appeared on were not always, but usually the ones that allowed for some diversity of views. Like, as I mentioned, in Washington, where you had different panelists talking about different things. And I will give them this much. They never tried to shut me up when I was on the air. They didn't invite me as often as they might have, knowing what my own views are about Hamas or other things.
Do you expect
but no, I don't. But when I was on the air, they let me say whatever I wanted to say, and that's why I thought, because I could say that in Arabic, and I wasn't worried that they would mistranslate it or that they would, sort of somehow filter it out. And I never agreed to appear on Al Jazeera English, because that, I think, doesn't have, in recent years, because that doesn't give me the credibility that I have with Arab audiences when I'm speaking to them in their own language. So I thought that it would be of some possible small use to balance the rest of Al Jazeera's very biased coverage.
Hi, I'm Roger Aronoff with Accuracy in Media, and for Mr. Fahmy and Mr. Pollack. You talked about when they came into the U.S. and bought Al Gore's current TV, and you said $2 billion. I know the selling price was $500 million.
Yeah,
so,
I said the amount of money they expended throughout the 2 years that they operated there. Yes.
So is there any more, maybe behind the scenes things that took place in making that deal in the first place? My other question is, how did they avoid the scrutiny of the U.S. government being allowed in as a propaganda network, foreign propaganda, and they were just allowed to go on the air here in this country? What went on behind the scenes there? What do you?
Well, I was not working with Al Jazeera English, and I was in prison when it was supposedly peaking, so had very little access to information. But throughout my research, Al Gore himself sued Al Jazeera for issues related to their escrow account. So you have the Vice President of the United States of America suing the network, Al Jazeera, because of issues with the escrow account. So that's what I know about Al Jazeera in the States, and I know about the 2 lawsuits I mentioned, Matthew Luke and Shannon Basilic, and when you read the claim, which is available on the internet, it's horrific what was happening in that network here in the United States. So I don't know why the U.S. allowed it in the first place. So that's all I know. I think Mr. Bullock would know more about that.
Okay, I can very briefly say something about that. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I am a U.S. citizen and a strong believer in freedom of the press. And, it's a First Amendment right that the U.S. Constitution guarantees. And that applies, and I think this is the way it should be, even to foreign propaganda outlets. So that from a legal standpoint, as I understand it, and in fact, the United States government allows, for example, Russia Today, RT, to operate a gigantic studio right here in Washington, D.C. It's a foreign propaganda outlet. And the same goes for many, many other news outlets, some of which are, I suppose, headquartered right here in this building, because we believe in freedom of the press. But the flip side of that is the freedom to expose the propaganda activities of those media outlets. Not to shut them down, not to censor them, not to prohibit them from operating in the United States, but to expose them to the light of truth, which I think is what we're doing here this morning. There are a few exceptions, and one of them that I'm quite familiar with is El Manar, which is the television channel of Hezbollah. That has been specifically prohibited from operating in the United States because it is considered legally and officially as not just an advocate of terrorism, but a material supporter of terrorism. And I believe that the same thing is true of another TV channel that was mentioned, Al Aqsa TV, which is the Hamas television channel. You can go on the internet and watch them freely, even here in the United States, but they are not allowed to operate a studio or to conduct financial transactions or to have a physical presence here in the United States. And American citizens are not allowed to accept, I think this is correct, to accept, to have any financial dealings with them directly. With those, but those are very, very specific exceptions, and I personally don't think that Al Jazeera quite makes it to that level of material support for terrorism.
There are laws about that, and you know, they're.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for attending here today. And if you need to get any updates on the lawsuits, it's in the packet. Thank you very much.